This is an event organised by Newcastle University's School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape to mark the publication of Lives in Architecture by Sir Terry Farrell, an account of his life and career. My name is Owen Hopkins and I'm the host this evening and the compere of the series of discussions that we have organised. Sir Terry Farrell is, of course, the world-renowned architect, town planner, and city maker. I think it's fair to say he's a local lad, growing up in Newcastle, attending the university here, and he is now a visiting professor. For this event, we're really pleased to be joined by a group of leading architects, designers, academics, and journalists to discuss the turning points that have marked Terry's career, and these people will act as conversationists with Terry on these kind of key moments and the broader architectural as well as political, economic circumstances of these particular moments. And we will conclude with a discussion reflecting on the book's key themes and ideas in relation to the present challenges facing architecture and cities. I'm going to introduce each conversationist as we go along. And we were hoping to begin with a brief introduction about the book from Helen Castle, who's the publishing director at the RIBA, which has published this book, and it's the first, as I understand, in a series of Lives in Architecture, but I don't think she has joined the meeting yet. So we may need to hear from Helen at the end rather than the beginning. I should note as well that the RIBA have organised a discount for attendees of the event this evening. And I will very shortly share the link that you need to use to claim that discount on the book in the chat. So now it's for me to hand over to Terry, of course, and our first conversationist, Charles Holland. Charles is founder of Charles Holland Architects. He's Professor of Architecture at the University of Brighton, and he's formerly director of FAT. So, Charles, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Owen. Good evening, Terry and everybody else. Thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this evening's celebration of Terry's book. I'm going to focus on the years where Terry was studying in America, and we've got a relatively short amount of time, so I'm going to try and cut to the quick and move to some questions because I'm really keen to find out more, having read a bit about the book. But just as a brief sort of background to how we might frame those questions, and for people who may not have read it or be completely familiar with Terry's biography, this happens after you've graduated from Newcastle, and then Terry, you go to the University of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia for I think 2 years, and we're in the very early 60s, aren't we? Maybe 62, 63?
Yeah, 62, 64.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, one of the things that struck me about it when I was reading the book, but also sort of before and knowing a little bit about that milieu, maybe the sort of the relationship of British architects to American academia, is you're there almost exactly at the same time as Norman Foster and Richard Rogers are at Yale. And I think in relation to your subsequent partnership with Nicholas Grimshaw, I was interested in the way that maybe the sort of two kind of turns that architecture takes at this point. One is a sort of interest in high tech, an interest in looking at kind of industrial and other forms of sort of manufacturing, which I guess your former partner and Foster and Rogers was deeply interested in. And the other is perhaps a turn towards the kind of contextual and the urban. And they feel quite different. And I wondered really, first of all, when you were there, whether you were sort of conscious that that was a kind of live debate, or even a sort of choice for you as to which direction you might take.
Well, my interest was awakened very much by Paul Davidoff and Ian McHarg, who were two of the teachers at Penn. And my personal tutor was Denise Scott Brown, and she was dating, if that's the right term, Bob Venturi. So I was in a milieu which was to formulate many of the foundations for postmodernism and all that meant, but I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you mentioned in the book, I think, that you felt that when you went to America, that the conversation there was more advanced, or was sort of in advance of the conversation that was happening in the UK. Was that a kind of, the advance there, was that a sort of emerging critique of modernism and an interest in the city, both, I suppose, in relation to things like Jane Jacobs, but also obviously what Denise Scott Brown was teaching, which was almost a sort of sociological analysis of taste and different taste cultures?
Yeah, Denise had not quite formulated that at the time, but I certainly feel that Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson was gripped me, and was fundamental in giving me a foundation of opinion, and it was subliminal. I went back to London where I left off with high tech, because I was the first into high tech with my thesis, I claim, and my student thesis at Newcastle. And I think the postmodernism was simmering.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, you also mentioned, of course, Louis Kahn, who must have been a fairly extraordinary figure to get exposed to. Were you taught directly by him? Was he a design tutor?
Yeah, he was. I was taught directly by him, but I didn't become an acolyte. I was wary of becoming an acolyte, a fanatic, and he was basically recruiting for his office, as I saw it.
Yeah. It's it feels really interesting to me that I think later on, and I'm not sure this is in the book, but I've certainly picked up on this somewhere else, and I've always been really keen to ask you about this, because I think you taught an AA studio in the late 70s, and did a studio or a brief which was called Learning from Chigwell. And that's obviously a reference back to Denise and Bob and learning from Las Vegas. How long did you run that for? A number of years? Was that a kind of continuing?
No, it was just 1 year.
Yeah.
We shared a studio with Izzy Metstein and Piers Goff. We were joint unit masters. Learning from Chigwell fed into what I was fascinated by at that time, which was returning to a pluralist and people's taste as against what you might call architects' taste,
So
which was more middle class.
Yeah, yeah. So were you interested in the way that people had adapted their homes and the sort of signs and symbols?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did sunbursts on every door, but different sunbursts. So we managed to formulate a way of patterning every door differently. And that set a precedent which we had probably inherited from my days at the students' hostel, which was we contributed very strongly to the architecture and the contracting. We did all the sunbursts ourselves.
Very nice. There's also a bit in the book, I think, where you buy a house in Maida Vale, which is a house I've seen drawings of in one of your other books, which is I've always really enjoyed, because you kind of sunk the floor down but carried on the skirting boards at the same level they'd always been on, which was always a detail I really liked. But was that around the same time that you were doing studios which were looking at popular taste?
Yeah. That was at the same time.
And did that feel lonely? Did it feel like you were ploughing a sort of furrow that was quite different to the sort of high tech or more clearly modernist architecture that was around at the time?
Well, it felt a contrarian, but I had other souls that I could talk to, Marcus Binney and the Covent Garden Community Association, and so on. So I wasn't on my own. Yeah,
that's interesting. So, and was going back to your time at Penn, Robert Venturi, this is before Complexity and Contradiction comes out, a few years before, isn't it? That's kind of more mid to late 66, I guess, is the critical year for that.
He was writing it.
So were you exposed to lectures that were sort of the formative chapters of?
I would like to think so, but I honestly, I don't think so.
And also, I mean, I know from elsewhere stories that one of the things that Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi first worked on together, or maybe even when they first met, was in connection with the Frank Furnace building, which I think was scheduled for demolition in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Was that something that you're aware of, and then did that kind of fire some of your interest in conservation and the sort of preservation of buildings as much as new things?
No, I think that was happening anyway, and I didn't understand and follow that. But I worked in Camden, New Jersey for a summer, and that convinced me that the Americans were very interested in heritage and conservation, and more so than England, which was the opposite at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that comes across very strongly. I mean, from things, you know, I've read by you before, but in the book as well, that interest in conservation, I think, is probably quite rare for an architect, because an architects instinctively want to sort of make the city again, don't they? They want to add new things. So it's quite, it feels very, very interesting, still quite provocative that as an architect you were drawn to the kind of preservation of bits of the city and consciously trying to preserve them. Again, I'm reminded, I suppose, of connections with Denise Scott Brown and a lot of the work that they did in Philadelphia. And I think particularly the South Street area, which was slated for demolition. And I think they did a lot of work with the community there to sort of build support for retaining it. But it still feels quite an unusual territory for an architect.
I've always fascinated by the South Street, the work that Denise was doing, but also Paul Davidoff, who was a teacher there, who was a lawyer by training, and he was giving seminars and lectures on choice theory of planning, which was a revelation.
Was that connected as well to Herbert Gans? Was he a figure that you were aware of?
No, he wasn't a figure I came across at the time.
I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time, so I'm going to be really disciplined. But I mean, I really love reading the chapter about America, having been involved a little bit in teaching there as well. And I think there's quite a long, there's a long tradition of British architects there. But I think the experiences that you described there are particularly unique. And I guess the kind of exposure to, figures as influential at that time as Louis Kahn must have been quite an incredible opportunity.
It was fundamentally stimulating, but I took away a certain amount of a jaundiced opinion of Louis Kahn. Because
of the sort of messianic sort of cult around him. Yes.
The cultish aspect, which wasn't just me.
Yeah, he was the Peter Zumthor of his day.
Yeah.
Maybe on that note, we should, because I know that we've got lots of really interesting bits of your book to talk to and lots of interesting people to ask you about that. So I'm going to finish that. It's been really delightful and really nice privilege to be able to actually ask you directly about some of this stuff, which I really enjoyed hearing about. So
thank you
for that, and I will join everyone later.
Great, thank you very much, Charles. So now for the second conversation, I'd like to introduce Dr. Léa-Catherine Jacka, who is the Senior Lecturer, the Manchester Architecture Research Group at the University of Manchester, author of several books, including the award-winning Exhibiting the Postmodern, the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale. So, Léa-Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much. You can hear me? Yeah. I have a few images just to show as a background. I mean, obviously things that everybody knows, but I thought, is it okay to share my screen for a second? So here, just so we have, I mean, those are, of course, things that everybody knows, but just to have them maybe in the background as we speak. Oops, no, sorry. Just gonna put them. So first of all, thank you very much, Owen, for the invitation. I think it's really exciting to, you can see my slide now?
No.
Not
no?
yet.
Ah, sorry, wait. Okay, typical. So let me. Yeah, now it works?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and also for the chance to read the book in premiere. We were lucky enough to have a a PDF and be able to read the book that I think is extremely interesting. And I had the chance to talk to Terry before in connection to some research I was doing on the TVAM building, and also to visit the office with some students a few years ago. And so we already had some conversation on specific parts, but it's great to now be able to ask more questions. And I will focus on the 1980s, or on the turn between the 1970s. So picking up on where Charles left in a way. And I would like to ask Terry about 4 different topics that I think are quite present. Some of them are threads that run through the whole book. One of them being the idea of social mobility. One of them being so this interest that we already mentioned a little bit on about popular taste, and how there was a kind of shift between the 70s and the 80s from high tech to postmodernism. And then the idea of ephemerality and branding in architecture that I think was quite present in the work of Terry in the early 1980s. And finally, education. But I will, I think Charles talked about, your education in the US, and then I would like to talk a little bit about the scene in London in the 1980s. So the first question is, the image here is, of course, your one of your most early work with Farrell and Grimshaw, and one of the most iconic building of that period. And in the early 1980s, you split from this practice, obviously, to go on your own. And I quite like this passage in the book where you say that you weren't really sure about this splitting at the beginning, but then you were exactly 41 and felt like you were ready for this, for going on your own path. So so one of the things that I think we could say that you split with Grimshaw, especially on sort of disagreements on stylistic aspect of architecture, and you at the time, so you say in your book that you develop an interest in popular taste. So I would like to hear you more about that, how that interest came about, where did it come from? Did it also kind of come from your upbringing or your childhood? And also, was it a form of liberation in a way from some of the work you were doing just before?
Well, it was a liberation, certainly. And it came about because of my background and my time at Penn, and with a growing interest in context and conservation and city making. Mm-hmm. It gradually grew in me, so that I was, by the time 79, 80 came around, I was at a different place to Grimshaw, very different place. And
so you were inspired by things like, obviously, Venturi and Scott Brown works on popular taste, and
I was interested in Venturi, Scott Brown, and Learning from Las Vegas was a seminal book. But I think it began before then with Paul Davidoff and Ian McHogg and Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was a fundamental figure in my time at Penn, because, and pop art was, because the soup cans and the comic strips were all part of popular culture. And I like that.
Yeah, there's a bit in the book where you mention, I mean, I was going to talk about TVAM later, but there's a bit in the book where you mention Venturi saying that TVAM was not postmodern, but it was more pop art, right? Especially the front facade.
Yeah, I think it was more pop art than postmodern, but the interior was very much postmodern. But the back wall team did a conservation job on it. So it was three things at once.
Yeah, which is in itself very postmodern, right?
Yes. Yeah.
To have this kind of multiplicity of identity. Yes. Is like multiplicity of identity in one single building, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so I'll go back now. I already deviated from my order of question, but the second thing I wanted to ask you was about Cenk's house. So you, this connects to the idea of social mobility, which, as I say, is very much present in the book. I think we already discussed that earlier, but that's something that really struck me in your memoir. This idea of social mobility is obviously comes back again and again and again. And you mention in the chapter on the 80s, you mentioned the commission. So at the turn of the 80s, you're commissioned by Charles Jenks and Maggie to do the conversion of the house in Holland Park, in Landbrook Grove in Holland Park. And you mentioned also how that was a shift for you, also kind of instrumental in the splitting from Grimshaw, because it also opened the door to, maybe I'm going to quote you here, I was entering territory that had been forbidden to me hitherto. From now, I was growing into new social sphere, and sure enough, in the last years of the decade, they introduced me to Jacob Rothschild, who wanted the greenhouse in Clifton Nursery, and I had moved on to have patrons of my own. So I don't know if you can say a little bit more about this this commission and how it was important for you.
It was a very important commission, but it was overlaid and interpreted by Charles Jenks as a classic case of postmodernism, and he was into postmodernism as a style much more than I was. But I was fascinated by the journey. This is the elements that, as the surface treatment was all his, but the ideas fundamentally were very much shared and originated with me. The moon well and the central staircase, the sun well, and I enjoyed that. But he overlaid it with a pattern and decoration, which he could elaborate on and in his writing and books, and he did.
So was there an issue of ownership? Because there's also, so I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this fireplace was also designed by Michael Graves. So there was really, it was really a collaborative work again, you know, sort of postmodern in itself, in the way the project had worked. So was there an issue of ownership or?
I felt very relaxed about ownership, and I've always felt relaxed about ownership because I welcome buildings that change. TVM changed radically. Yeah. And I enjoyed the fact that Michael Graves, Piers Goff, and so many others were involved in the Jenks house. I found it fascinating.
Well, Well, that's this idea of changing of the building works quite well with what I was going to move on to next, which is this idea of ephemerality of architecture. So there's two things. I think I wanted to talk about these two buildings, the Clifton Nurseries in Covent Garden and the TVAM building, which are, I mean, the Clifton Nursery is a little bit before, but more or less the same period, which is where you also made your first appearance as a solo architect. And it's interesting that both buildings, not exactly in the same ways, but both buildings are meant to be ephemeral. So the Clifton Nursery was a pavilion. It was meant to last, I'm not sure exactly for how long, but was ephemeral. And the TVAM building was not necessarily thought as an ephemeral piece of architecture, but was, you said that the building was designed for a company, and that when that company would no longer exist, the building didn't need to be preserved, or you also quite interestingly didn't want to battle for its preservation because you thought that it was very much linked to this new company, which ended lasted for 9 years and ended in 1992. So how this ephemerality of buildings was instrumental in starting your career as a solo architect?
Well, it's interesting. You've chosen a slide which shows the second Judy's Pantry, which
which is the
and it was on a site which was earmarked for the Opera House extension. Now occupy the Opera House proper, and I think that I influenced the Opera House in its form and structure and so on, and the opportunities, the architectural opportunities and the real estate opportunities. I almost wrote the brief for the Opera House extension.
Yeah, so do you see this building as a sort of almost like a test run, or a kind of test?
Well, it was a reality. It was Maggie Jenks called it a triumph, and I enjoyed it while it lasted. But it wasn't intended to be permanent.
Yeah. Well, the TVM is a little bit different, right? Because I guess that from the beginning you didn't know how long it would last. I mean, they didn't win the franchise the second time, so the company...
It was a minimum of 7 years.
Yeah.
But the 7 years expired and they didn't win the franchise. So it was changed.
Yeah. And in this case, it's very much linked to, I have a few images that show also this, so this cartoon, and also this kind of advert from the newspaper, but that show also how much this building was linked to the history of a new company and something very avant-garde for Britain in the early 80s, and how much this this kind of, working together with a new company that was being created, and not only a new company, but really a new ways of doing television. How was that inspiring for the design of the building?
They were a bunch of people that were in front of the camera, Peter Jay, David Frost, and so on, and they formed a group like United Artists did, which was Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and so on, and they failed to tie up, having won it, they failed to tie up the the company that the opportunity for Wandsworth for a television studio, which they should have built. But I think that was a major opportunity for me to present to them the idea that the iconic nature of television relies upon an image, architectural image of a place. And I argued that when the news came on, you saw Big Ben. When Dallas came on, you saw the farmhouse ranch building and so on. And I said, you could achieve the same with TVAM.
Yeah, and it was the case, right? Because the opening of the show in the morning, you know, the keystone of the building was featuring in the opening of the show. So it did work. I mean, the building did work in this way. It did work as a symbol.
And I took the graphic design literally, and it was a sunrise. And so I threaded the elements of sunrise through this facade.
As a sort of logo. And
Yeah.
I don't know if I have time for one last question. I'm not so good as Charles. I didn't look at the time, so just stop me if. But my last question was about education, but bringing, you know, you talked about the context in Penn in the 60s, but then you went on to teach, and Charles mentioned it before, you went on to teach at the AA in 79, 1980. And that was just like 2 years after the book of Zhang's came out, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. And I wanted to, I don't think you elaborate much on this in the book, so I wanted to hear more about how was the atmosphere at the AA in 1979, 1980, and what, you know, that was kind of the second half of the Boyarsky term as a director. So what was the feeling in the school at the time?
Well, it was very excitable, and it hasn't changed. It's postmodernism was the latest thing, and they were all into it. But it was the same when I taught at the AA in the 60s after coming back from America, and it was all high tech. And that was just as enthusiastic and as the youth. And the AA was no exception to the youth of the time.
Okay, I guess I've probably used all my time. I don't know, Owen, are you the key?
Yeah, if you're happy to draw it to a close there, then
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so our final conversationist is Adam Nathaniel Furman. Adam is an artist, a designer. He's actually the co-author with Terry of the book Revisiting Postmodernism, and he's co-director of Saturated Space, a research cluster at the just mentioned Architectural Association. So Adam, over to you.
Sea of tranquility known as the AA. Thanks, Owen. Hi, Terry. I'm so lucky to have been able, like all the other guests, to have read the book beforehand. We're talking briefly about the 90s, which was, like every other decade in Terry's life, extremely eventful.
Yes.
It's quite a nerve-wracking read sometimes, because it's like this sort of constant roller coaster through every part of your career, but it's really thrilling. And the 90s is I guess the period of your career which I relate to very intimately. It's kind of how I got to know your work, because it bookended my actual life, in the sense that when I was quite young in the early 90s, my favorite buildings in the entire world, I was a weird child who liked looking at interesting buildings, was Alban Gate and Charing Cross, the urban development and the office building in the city. And I was terribly excited by them, and I can blame them for having got me into architecture in the first place. And then as I got older, there was the SIS building, which was finished in the mid-90s across the river from Charing Cross, where when I reached the age of clubbing, I was a regular at Heaven, which I'm not sure if any of you know is a fantastically important gay nightclub, which was protected underneath Terry's development of Charing Cross, and had the most fantastic, many fantastic times there, also in the spaces above it and around it. And then I concluded the 1990s by making my only visit ever to Hong Kong, which was my, I guess, graduation gift from my family. And the only 3 buildings that I really wanted to see when I was there were I.M. Pei's Bank of China, Norman Foster's HSBC, and of course, the Peak, which had been finished just a couple of years before I visited. And I can say very easily that I was very underwhelmed by 2 of them, and took 3 full films of photography on the one that I did like, which is obviously the Peak. So that's a sort of personal pleasure enjoyment, and it's kind of what got me into architecture. I went to study it the next year. But for you, Terry, the decade began with these huge projects, which were on the tail end of the 80s, I believe, you received. And then I didn't know this, but from reading the book, an incredible shift that you had to make from London, also with a lot of your office, to Hong Kong to find new work. And I just, if you could tell us a little bit about why that happened, because I find it amazing to see how you made that transfer.
Well, in 1986, I was down to 15 people. And by the end of the year of 86, I had employment of 150 people because of the big buildings we had won. But it all fell away by 89, 90, because I could see the denouement of the whole scene in London. And I was determined to break into new ground. And I didn't like the idea of breaking up the teams with the subsequent unemployment. And I faced London, which in effect went down to 40 people from 150. But we managed to get 3 schemes up and running in Hong Kong. And the first one was the Peak. And I knew with the Peak that in a new field and a new era and a new territory, that a landmark scheme would ensure that we were known in that arena. So we piled into the Peak with great enthusiasm, and we won it. And then very soon after, we won the consulate. And then very soon after that, we won the Kowloon North West Station, which was a very big project. And so I moved 60 people out from London to Hong Kong and saved the practice.
And in the West Kowloon project, am I correct in understanding that that was one of the beginnings of something that you did a lot later, which was you spatially master planned a much larger area, but then didn't do the architecture itself?
I did the station, which was very considerable in size, a million square feet, which paled by comparison with the total, which was 13 million square feet, and it was substantially underground, but it had a presence on the surface, and I really determined to make a mark with that project, and sure enough, we did. It was hugely influential in changing the practice.
And I believe that it directly led to Incheon, the transport interchange.
Yeah, and we became experts at railway stations. Having done Charing Cross, which was a railway station, but it was an office building, a railway, and it was an operational railway station rather than the chance to do a station and get us into the transport game. And it continues today.
On a different subject, you touch on the chapter on the 90s in the book. You touch upon, I think it was, sorry, I didn't take as very good notes, but it was an event in London where you were referred to in not the most fantastic manner by some colleagues of yours. And I guess in your career, it seems from having followed your career and reading about it, you've quite carefully, on the one hand, avoided becoming a sort of self-repeating or self-referential starchitect who is a promulgator of a style, which you could have gone in that direction with the success in the 90s in Asia. And also simultaneously, you never really became, I believe you didn't accept invitations to be a Royal Academician, and sort of kept yourself slightly apart from the kind of clubby world of London architecture when they sort of wanted to have you. And I'm just wondering if this is something that you had intentionally done, or it's just something that has happened through your character, and if it's a sort of direction that you've carefully cultivated in your professional career.
I think I became conscious of it gradually, but the 20th century lecture that I gave 5 years ago introduced me as a contrarian figure. And I quite liked that contrarian because everybody went one way and I went the other. And I think it was in my nature from childhood.
And then in terms of also coming back to yourself and your childhood, you come from a working class background and have managed to achieve various types of sort of great success throughout your career in different areas of the profession. But reading the book, I come back to my first point. It's a nerve-wracking roller coaster ride, and reading the kind of the highs that were achieved at various points, and then the sort of sudden, incredible shifts and changes, having to move 60 people across the world after having had to go and move somewhere to find work, then move completely into a new field of being focused on urban planning, working with government. These sort of incredible shifts that must also take quite a lot of, must be quite difficult financially, but also take have an effect on one's personal life. Do you think that somebody from your background these days would be able to pursue a career of the same scale as yours with the same ease? Or do you think opportunities make that more difficult now?
Gosh,
that's my last question.
That's for the future to tell. I can't say. I know what I did, and it was a roller coaster, but I didn't intend it to be a roller. I followed my nose, and I think the cult of an architect is currently a branding process. The architects like Big and so on, Prangeri and Zaha, a particular thing, and they specialize, and they concentrate on branding. And I think I was called the no man architect by a critic. I quite like that, but
sorry, what were you? Can you repeat what you were called?
No brand.
That's good.
No brand architect.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry.
So, thank you, Adam.
Brilliant, and thank you from me as well to Adam and of course to Terry. So we're now going to bring all of the contributors so far into the discussion, which is going to be chaired by Deborah Carray, who is a journalist, writer and editor, and is founder of Clove magazine. And we're going to discuss some of the book's themes and issues in relation to the present challenges facing architecture and cities. So, Deborah, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Owen, and thank you all of you. That was a really fascinating series of discussions, and thank you, Terry, of course. For me, framing these conversations around particular turning points in the decades of Terry's career feels really apt, because I think it's fair to say that we're living through something of a turning point in history right now. From an urban perspective, many aspects of city life that we took for granted at the start of the year have been thrown out of the window overnight. Now many people are questioning whether it's worth living in a city at all. And there's others who have no choice but to go to work, and for them, the city has become a constant danger. And then there's this growing, terrifying number of people who no longer have the jobs and incomes to afford to live in urban centres. So I think it's fair to say that it's a real turning point for the city. So the question is, where do we go from here? And how can architects and educational institutions confront these problems? So I'd like to start by maybe talking about the role of architectural institutions in general, and specifically the Institute for Architecture at Newcastle University that Owen is working to set up, and to which Terry has presented his practice archive. So could I turn to Terry first and ask, would you mind telling us a bit about your motivation for giving your archive to Newcastle, and what kind of an institution are you hoping that it'll become a part of eventually?
Well, it was spun off from the Farrell report, which was argued for an urban room where the model and virtual models would show you the past, the present, and the future of the city. And the city making is the theme of this Farrell Centre, but it's expanded to have an exhibition area for the School of Architecture and Landscape and Planning, and it has the startup facilities on the third floor. I think the habit of collecting was begun by my grandfather, who gave me his life's work when he was about my age, about early 80s. And he inculcated, if that's the right word, in me a desire to record and keep everything. And I have kept a very considerable amount of material, and it seemed logical that it should go back to Newcastle, which I've continued through the decades to have links, Newcastle, particularly the master plan, which I've kept faith with, of the university campus.
I wanted to maybe turn to Owen next to give the kind of institutional perspective a bit. What do you hope to do with Terry's archive, and how will you engage the public in it and build an institution around it?
Well, I mean, he's already said a lot of that, so I kind of agree with all of that, really. I mean, that it's a really fascinating prospect, but ultimately, in all of this, in establishing the Farrell Centre and this new institution that's embedded in the university but is outward looking towards the city, that draws from the archive, it comes from the idea that the forces shaping the present, the future of cities, whether they are architectural, whether they're coming from planning or public policy, whether they're technological, of course, whether they're economic, environmental, all of that should be of public concern. It is of public interest, of course. So that's the kind of the mission that we've set ourselves with this institution, is to create somewhere where people can come and be engaged in and get a stake in the city and its future, how it is going to develop, and the shape it takes. And what we're currently working on is thinking about how we go about that. What are the programs that we need to run? What are the exhibitions, whether they're temporary or permanent, that we need to establish, that are going to appeal to all of the local populace? We are kind of spreading the net very, very wide. We want everyone to feel this is a place that they can come to and engage with and feel part of, ultimately. And of course, we also want to connect to regional, national, international debates as well, and use the opportunity of creating this centre to create a real kind of landmark institution that is embedded in the local but speaks to a global audience as well.
I just wanted to pause for a second to say that I hope that we can take some questions from the audience at the end. So if anyone has them as we're talking, you could put them in the chat, and then we'll try and get to them before we end. I wonder if I could turn to Léa-Catherine. Part of your work is in the idea of architectural exhibitions and communicating architecture. So what do you see as the role of kind of institution like this in communicating architectural ideas to the public? And, you know, do you sense that there's a greater appetite maybe for those kind of conversations now, given how important the public realm and cities are, and, you know, how they're at the forefront of everyone's minds? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think it is totally, you know, of great interest now. It's also a very particular kind of, I think in this case, it's a very unique sort of center, because it's centered around Terry's archive, but it's also obviously much more than that, as Owen has explained. And I think the aim is to do exhibitions and conversations that talk about the city in general and are embedded in the context of Newcastle. But I think there's really an interest. I was mentioning also earlier, I showed image of the cosmic house, of Jenks's house, and we mentioned that also in a previous conversation, that this is also going to become a sort of similar, I mean, not the same, but also an archive combined with exhibition space. And so I think this is also a new maybe type of, because there was a conscious decision also by Terry, and correct me if I'm wrong, to give the archive to Newcastle, as opposed to maybe include the archive in a bigger institution that collects the archives of many architects. Could have been the RIBA or the CCA in Montreal, or the V&A, or I don't know, any other museums. But this idea to kind of create an exhibition space and a happening around the collection and the archive, I think is quite interesting and unique.
I think the archive is being exploited, if that's the right word, separately from the Institute of the Farrell Centre. It's not hidebound by the archive. It'll dip and dive into the archive according to what the exhibition is. But the role of the archive is not solely to supply material for the process. It will have a life of its own.
Yeah, you also mentioned the work with schools and with children, and how this, I thought that was super interesting. I don't know if you want to say something about this.
Yes, I'm very conscious of the social mobility aspect, and the fact that it's a posh profession, and it has barriers to progress for someone from my background. And I don't want to hold up the archive as the exemplar, but rather I wanted to change the culture of architecture, because the last 20 years I've become more convinced that it's wrong, and it should be placed based on place and city making, much more.
Yeah, so I wonder how an institution like this, or institutions in general, can help the profession to become more democratic and inclusive. I know that, Adam, something that you've spoken about in the past is kind of the homogeneity of architectural education, and how, you know, you champion design that's more plural and inclusive. And I wonder what you see the role of institutions like this that speak to the public in kind of fostering that.
Well, they're hugely important, especially if they're run slightly away from the usual circuit of people down in London, and they speak to local people, local issues, and they create a culture, and they do, and the best ones can do that. And it's fascinating, the setup, by the sounds of it, the way it's going to have this sort of element that relates very much to the city, but then it's also going to foster businesses, like living businesses as well with that. And then there's the archive, which is kind of connected to the university. So it sounds like it really has the potential to draw people in from much wider net than usual and attract them. I don't know how it can affect wider structural issues in the architectural profession, but at least it can really interest a much broader audience and get their voices to be involved.
I agree. Think there's almost a kind of activist position that institutions are able to take these days, and I think it is one of the backdrops to this is, you know, thinking about what the interfaces are between the architectural profession and the public that it claims to serve ultimately, because you think of the media, architectural criticism, TV. The presence of architecture in those spheres has dropped dramatically. You know, most national papers don't have architecture critics anymore. Architecture is hardly ever on TV. If it is, it's in the guise of sort of you know, home improvement shows, or you know, even something like Grand Designs, which gives a very skewed sense of what it is that architects do and what architecture actually is. You know, you go back into the sort of 60s and 70s, even in the 80s, that architecture was much more of a presence in the sort of media landscape. And it's up to institutions to pick up the slack and be that interface between the profession and the public, and to really push that as far as they can. I think the opportunity here is that, you know, we are hopefully going to be a new type of institution, a hybrid institution in many ways, where you don't necessarily have the baggage that comes with architecture trying to find a place in another type of cultural institution with a much broader mission. Here we can be quite specific about what it is that we are trying to do and how we go about it. So I obviously believe that these types of institutions are incredibly important, and you know, it's you know, there's a huge amount of potential that we need to realize.
And it's also about, I guess, from what I've understood, it's not only just architecture, it's getting people really more understanding of and excited about and involved in the making of cities and urban planning, which can seem even more opaque.
Yeah, but I don't want to monopolize this, but I'd say one further point to that is, you know, I have, you know, this belief that everyone is actually interested in architecture. Everyone is interested in cities, but perhaps they don't realize it or see it in those terms. Most people are interested in a building that's going up on their street. Most people are interested in transport infrastructure and how it works or doesn't work. Most people are interested in how social care is delivered. All of these very different and disparate things are all inextricably connected to architectural and issues to do with urbanism. And what we need to try to do is convert that interest into, for want of a better description, architecture with a capital A and urbanism with a capital U, and give people the tools and the confidence to engage with it in those terms. So that's the big mission that we've set ourselves.
Charles, I wonder, as someone who practices and teaches architecture, how do you see that bridging the divide between the two and bridging the divide between architecture and the public? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I was very struck probably by quite a lot of architects, and certainly people in the architectural world, by, you know, the recent government white paper about planning, and the relative lack of attention or even mention of architects within it. So clearly, I think the things that Owen's talking about are really interesting. I'm not sure how much people actually connect those things with architecture. Clearly, people connect, you know, grand designs, although weirdly the architect plays a very small role in grand designs, because it's much more about the story of the people, which always strikes me. But I think those things of like, well, where do things come from? How do cities form? What decisions are made around them? How does that kind of group of sort of almost invisible people, the kind of highway engineers and sort of people who organise stuff. I'm not sure how much people think that that is architecture. So in a sense, I think an institute like this is an incredibly important opportunity to try to present those things as being things that are authored. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, oh, well, that's designed by this person, but authored in the sense that one can then start to say, well, could it be like that? Or could it be like this? Or starting to sort of be able to unpack the decisions that lead to cities being formed the way they are. I mean, one thing I'd like to add to that really, which just relates back to Terry's work in a particular way. I think one of the things that's very valuable about his work, and I mentioned it in our chat at the beginning, is an attitude to kind of the existing city. And I think that's really important because if you look at things like, I mean, Terry's very early work in Bayswater or in Covent Garden, or even his own house, or learning from Chigwell, a suburb of London, there's an interest in what's already there and in sort of a really inventive way of working with the existing fabric. So it's about preserving things and working things, but also adding stuff and not being too precious about adding stuff. And that to me seems a really interesting thing when we're at a point where clearly, we're trying to preserve buildings, we're trying to avoid demolition for its own sake, we're trying to conserve, our resources and dwindling resources at that. So a really inventive way of dealing with existing things and being kind of reinventing stuff that we already have seems to me a really useful lesson that the archive can hopefully bring out.
Well, that leads really nicely onto the next section of what I was going to ask about, which is, the city right now and where we go from here. So the existing city, it's transformed overnight. The way we use the city has changed within, a matter of days almost. The daily commute no longer is something that's a given. We don't think of the city centre at the moment as somewhere that we can all crowd in and enjoy ourselves and socialise and work. So if I could come to Terry again, the city as it exists, is that something that you think should hold, or will it? How do you see this as a turning point for how we see the city?
Well, during my career, versions of the city making, and I think this is a lull that is going to feed into a crisis that will feed into constructively reappraising the city. But cities will endure. It will make people think, and it's to do with sustainability and environment in the biggest sense, which I think is school children, and I refer to school children a lot in the book, because they are the future, and the future will eventually sort itself out, and the priority will be given to the city anew, but it will be amended. It'll be changed. And I don't know what to, but that's an exciting thing.
Yeah, that's exciting, is optimistic. I wonder whether, on the subject of postmodernism, as a postmodernist, what do you think that postmodernism, the ideas of postmodernism have to say about how cities transform from here?
Well, I use the term postmodernist in a very broad sense of contextualism and interest in their city and its history and place. And I think that will not go away. I think it will be reinforced. A change, all change will be have to be adapted to, designed, and the role of the architect and the landscaper and the planner in that, and those changes will be critical, but not as critical as they think it will be. I think there needs to be a reality that is taught at architecture school, that they will not have the influence they had. When we graduated, we thought we were and we would want to make the world, but actually the world is made by many hands over time.
I wonder whether there's going to be a shift in interest from the city to the rural. I think it's something that's been talked about a bit in recent times anyway. I wonder whether...
Yeah.
That will happen.
So, I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing, because I mean, I think there has been, you know, from my side, I think there's been like a huge amount of attention on the city and a lot of improvement in, you know, everyday development and house building and design in many ways. That isn't the case outside of big metropolitan centres at all, where the kind of quality of housing design and things has kind of plummeted. So I think if something good comes out of this, it might be that there's a lot of, you know, creative thinking, important thought and effort about how we make places outside of the big metropolitan centres as well. I mean, it's interesting because Terry, I think Owen mentioned the urban room, and I think I might have one in that there's an urban room in Dover, which is where my practice is based, and we're possibly moving it to my studio. And that feels really important to be part of like a conversation with places which aren't necessarily normally on the map of those kind of really important conversations about the place, how they will develop over time. So yeah, maybe some critical and creative thinking on places that have been rather neglected might, because of the impetus of people maybe to move out or just simply spending more time working and being at home rather than traveling to another place, might be a positive outcome.
Adam, are you, sorry, who was going to speak? Terry?
No, you go ahead.
I was going to ask Adam if he's optimistic about the city in the future. Do you feel, you know, a city at a time that we're not feeling that it's a place of kind of social interaction and joy and serendipity? I don't know whether...
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. It's not like cities are going to go anywhere. They've been around since, I don't know, is it like 5000 BC or something? They're going to remain really important. And I don't see a shift of, I see a shift of people discussing just now, you know, looking at some positives that might come out of the necessity of the current situation, like Charles mentioned. But I don't see anyone wildly celebrating, saying they're so happy that they're never going to go back to the city centre. Yeah. So I think it's maybe just a gentle rebalancing which needed to happen anywhere, where we do appreciate, you know, maybe there was a bit of overexcitement of the rediscovery of cities, large metropolitan centres over the past 25 years, and maybe now it's just going to calm down a little bit.
I agree.
Yeah. Léa-Catherine, to come to you. Yeah, this discourse around the city and the urban age and the enthusiasm for the city, how do you see that panning out now? Do you think that's been dampened a little bit, and how will the conversation change?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Am I? No, okay. I was on mute. I would agree with Adam. I think that, you know, it's not going to change radically. I mean, things like one of the biggest, well, maybe not one of the biggest, but one of the changes is also things like the use of Airbnb and the way people also, you know, use the city as a in a wrong way, I mean, I use Airbnb as everybody else, but we all know it's bad for cities. So maybe it will just rebalance things like that. I read somewhere that it's the end. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the end of Airbnb, but it will definitely change a bit these things that had become exaggerated and had also destroyed cities. So hopefully it will have, I mean, I love cities, so I think I will still go to city center no matter what. I'm not gonna. Yeah.
Maybe we could take some questions from the audience now, because there's quite a few of them coming in. So Stephen Parnell is asking whether Terry could say something about his memories of school when he studied in Newcastle.
School of architecture, or
memories of school from when he studied here, what it was like, and in retrospect, does he think anything influenced him at all, particularly memorable teachers? And how did he get to Penn from here?
I felt the temporary teachers, like Harry Booton, was very influential, and Harry Faulkner Brown in the last year. They were very influential to me, but they were fringe. They were not central. The career teachers were careerists, and the central character of teaching has changed. I think for the better.
Another question for you. What I think someone would, Dina Tiniakos would like you to say a bit more about how you think architects and urbanists can engage the public more.
I think the public is very engaged in sustainability and the environment. And I think that we should work back from what the public is interested in, rather than impose our will on them. And I don't think the subject of architecture is ignored or debased. I think it's just changed. And I think the avenue is to go with the flow.
There's a couple of questions about your opinion on specific developments. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on whether you have any involvement in the Newcastle Quayside development.
Yes.
What remit was given, and does he think this was achieved, is the question from Amanda Hepburn.
I think I regret not having a building on the quayside, because I think that you will the role of the master planner is substantially to get planning consent, and it tends to be ignored from then on. And the extreme is Camborne, where I'm still proclaimed as the master planner, but 20 years of silence from the client's side has ensued after getting the planning consent. And the same with Newcastle Quayside. I don't think I've had a lot to do with the quayside since it was passed on planning.
I think I'll do one more question from my own list before we wrap up, which is, you said earlier, Terry, that I quite like being called a contrarian. I was wondering if you could give us a contrarian opinion on the city today and where we're heading in the future, something that hasn't been said about this particularly weird moment that we're living in?
Well, I think it will pass. I think we'll, 10 years' time, we'll have assimilated this and moved on. And it will be different, but it will move on. And the city will survive.